Welcome back, Geo students, and let's begin our agriculture notes, part one. In this set of notes, we're going to talk about commercial agriculture, and so that is agriculture where farming is done for profit. Next set of notes will be agricultural notes, part two, where we look at subsistence farming. In order to start a conversation off, we're going to look at how agricultural practices change through history, and then we're going to get into the characteristics of commercial agriculture. When you look at the early origins of agriculture, we have to go back to 10,000 BC, in other words, 12,000 years ago. Prior to that, early humans were hunters and gatherers, following animals and foraging the land for whatever they could find. This was a nomadic lifestyle where people weren't sitting down, creating homes that were more permanent, having territory or plots of land of their own. Around 10,000 BC, the first agricultural revolution, also known as the Neolithic agricultural revolution, occurs. What kind of crops were grown would have been based upon where in the world you were, because there were several different hearths for the agricultural revolution. Or in general, in the same time period, people started learning that you could plant seeds from plants and regrow them time and time again, which allowed people to settle down and not have to chase the animals around so much. And you can see that on the second set of bullet points here. In Southwest Asia, barley and wheat became a staple crop. In East Asia, rice and millet, and in Central Africa, rice. And over in Latin America, you have beans, cotton, potatoes, and corn, which at that time was called maize. So a cartoon here, just as a reminder of the hunting and gathering lifestyle that humans had prior to the Neolithic agricultural revolution. The male caveman there says, "Hey, I'm the hunter, you're supposed to be the gatherer." The woman's saying, "Well, he was standing here on the stuff I wanted to gather." And actually, women are largely attributed for the discovery of planting seeds and propagating plants and overseeing the first agricultural revolution. Another image here, the world's first farmers, 10,000 BC. I think what is noteworthy is in the upper right corner there, where you have homes being established, more permanent settlements. Map of the world here is showing the origin and diffusion of the major crops that have been mentioned. When you look at over 10,000 years ago, you're looking at things like squash, yams, barley, wheat, lentil, oats, rice, and mango and taro. Some of the other plants that you see or crops you see get developed later, the idea of being able to replant these things. And then as you check out the diffusion of it, or the spread, you can see the different routes from the hearths that these items took. To give you a visual, some people say, well, it's a cassava. It's a root plant, so you can see kind of like a potato, I guess, or a yam of sort. You have taro and cowpeas and pigeon peas. These are rich in protein, and then sorghum is another type of wheat. When it comes to, along with the agricultural revolution, we find the domestication of animals occurring. And so some of the hearths that you see here for these animals would be mainly in the Eurasian land mass, and in particular Southwest Asia, where you can see that pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, and then you get into Central Asia and you have horses. Dogs were still Southwest Asia, and chicken in Southeast Asia. Over in the Americas, the native domesticated animals were llamas, alpacas, and turkeys. So one of the significant things in our history is that when these domesticated animals were brought across as Europeans and Africans came over the Atlantic Ocean, they brought a lot of the animals with them, but not only the animals themselves, they also brought the diseases that were born out of the mixing with these animals. And so the diseases that the Europeans and Africans had spent hundreds or thousands of years developing immunity to, the Americans didn't have any immunity to that, the Native Americans, that is. And so when that encounter occurred, up to 96% of Native Americans were wiped out as a result of the diseases that were brought across, mainly because people that lived in this part of the world had exposure to these animals and the diseases that could be born from them. Here's a more up-close view of the diffusion of some of the goods that were coming from the Americas to Europe during the colonial period and the age of exploration. This exchange has been called historically the Columbian Exchange, although more modern social scientists are changing that word or taking the Columbian out of it and renaming it. I think the big things to point out: what was brought across from Eurasia and Africa was the disease as well as the livestock. There's actually a diffusion of plants from America to Asia. It's going to occur actually in the 1900s as they come out of university laboratories and they come up with faster growing versions of corn and rice, and they introduce those to more populated parts of the world. That was known as the Green Revolution, but that's a topic for a different time. So the two main types of agriculture that we're going to look at in this unit are commercial and subsistence. We'll start by looking at commercial, which is going to be found primarily in more developed countries. And what is happening there is they're producing food for sale off the farm. In more developed countries, they're producing food not just for the people of their country, but they're producing food that can be distributed worldwide. The other type of agriculture, which we'll look at in our next set of notes, is subsistence agriculture, where you're going to find those in less developed countries. And there, the agriculture is used largely for personal consumption, or maybe the consumption to a very small scale of like a village or a small territory of people. So this type of agriculture can vary not only by the level of development, but also by the climate that's in the area that people are living, and as well as their culture. This slide is listed as a very important slide. We call it the Global Agriculture slide. It's actually reproduced at the very end of this set of notes, and the reason is we're going to be using this slide when we do an activity at the end of the week called Ag Stories. And the map's important because it shows you the dominant type of farming in each part of the world. What you'll really want to focus in on when you start looking at it is, here are the different types of subsistence agriculture. These are the different types of commercial agriculture. You're going to have an activity where we're going to give you a type of farm, and we'll give you a few descriptors about it. You'll want to go back into your notes and use this as a guide to help you determine what type of farming is being described. And then not only do you figure that out, but then you've also got to figure out on a map which part of the world are we talking about on the map. So once you figure out what type of farming is going on, you have to look at the map and say, oh, okay, well, it looks like that story was describing intensive subsistence with wet rice. So I'm going to need to find a spot on the map that has that. Okay. But for now, and today, we're going to look at commercial agriculture, and you can see there are 6 types of farming that we'll be discussing when we get to commercial agriculture. First type is mixed crop and livestock farming, which is common in the central United States and Europe. It's where you have a farm where you have crops being grown like a corn or soybeans, but you also have animals being raised there as well. And the corn or the soybean largely is being used to feed the livestock, and then what's left over, I guess, could be sold off. What you'll also find is a process known as crop rotation that helps maintain the yield or the amount of food that is coming off of each plant. So the larger the yield, the more food that's coming off the plants. And the income for these mixed crop and livestock farms comes from the sale of the animal products. So it could be the meat, could be the skin, it could be other parts of the animal that people use for various reasons. One of the benefits of mixed crop and livestock is that the workload is pretty evenly distributed and provides a stable income for those farmers. So you can see an example here. Where is this occurring in the U.S.? Well, corn farming right in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. Corn is a pretty big part of people's diets. Corn grows in great abundance here. It gets used in processed foods as well. It's high in calorie content. So not only does that create a problem for humans with obesity, but it also creates obesity in animals, which when we're talking about raising cattle, becomes a popular process because for many connoisseurs of beef, they feel that when there's a little more fat on the animal, it becomes tastier. You look at soybean production, again, looking at the upper Midwest and also continuing along the Mississippi River Valley down towards Louisiana. Hog and pig production then going along with the corn and soybeans. You can see the largest amount of it occurring in southern Minnesota and Iowa, and little traces of it in other parts of the country. You look at turkeys. Again, I think we did a choropleth back in Unit 1. Showed Minnesota as being one of the top 5 turkey producing states in the country. There's some of the other areas where you see that. Dairy farming is a different style of farming that we can talk about. Normally, you're going to expect to find the farms located near urban areas, and the farms that surround and supply the milk to that urban area is known as the milk shed. Dairy farming is growing in practice in less developed countries. In fact, India is now the #1 producer of milk in the world. Now, that is not just cow milk, that also includes goat milk. The milk then gets sold to retailers or processors, and the final form is going to depend upon the distance from the markets. Challenges in dairy farming is that, one, it's a lot of work with a lot of machinery needed for not a lot of profit. Milk costs are kept relatively low, although prices do fluctuate, and when the price gets really low, it becomes tougher and tougher for dairy farmers to stay in business. Oftentimes, dairy farmers are going to be subsidized by the government, in other words, given cash payments to help them offset any losses that they may take on as they're producing their products. There's year-long attention that's needed to production of dairy farming. In other words, you really can't take a day off. And there are some pretty high costs associated with feeding your dairy cows or goats in the wintertime when the crops aren't able to grow very well the further north that you get. The other thing to note about it is that with dairy farming, it has to occur in lots of different areas because of the fact that milk spoils pretty quickly. The largest dairy producing state, a lot of people think it's Wisconsin, and it is per capita, but the state that produces the largest amount of cheese and dairy products is California now. That wasn't always the case. When you look at world milk production, we had mentioned that India is #1 in the world, and you can see other countries then that fall behind in the second tier. These are, in general, more developed nations or newly industrialized countries. The third type of farming we're going to look at is grain farming. And so here we're talking about wheat, oats, corn, rice, barley, etc. Again, another sign of development here is, look at this image that shows all these combines. I think there's over 20 of them that are all coming in full force there. And we're talking machines that are over in hundreds of thousands of dollars in value. The crops are grown primarily for human consumption then. The #1 exported crop from the United States is the wheat. And there are a couple different seasons in which the wheat is planted. You have the spring season in the Dakotas and the Montanas when it becomes warm enough again to grow. In winter, late winter, you can plant down in Kansas and Colorado and Oklahoma. There's another major region in the West Coast or near the West Coast called the Palouse region of Washington. That's eastern Washington, inland from the Cascade Mountains. So here's that Palouse region. You have the upper Midwest, and you have the breadbasket of the United States, Nebraska on down to the northern part of Texas there. So notice it's just west of where a lot of the mixed crop and livestock farming is done. Grains and oats, barley, up the North Plains. The fourth type of farming, commercial farming, is livestock ranching. It's common in areas where crops don't grow as readily. And you can see that ranching was very popular in the United States right after the Civil War, so post-1860, and they had a good 20-year run as people were expanding and moving to the west from the Mississippi and starting to make their way towards California. And what popped up were cattle towns in Kansas like Abilene and Dodge City. Chicago became a distribution center and processing center for a lot of the cattle that was raised out west. They were able to use railroads and bring the cattle back in for processing there. Conflict grew over time as more and more people moved out west for land in the west, and so the ranges in which cattle were able to roam freely became smaller and smaller in size, and there was disputes over property between different cattle owners, which led to barbed wire being used to end that free range grazing. And that amount of grazing land continues to decline today, and now we see cattle being raised in commercial feedlots, or concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs as they're called. Commercial ranching is also found in the grasslands of Australia and South America. Here's a map demonstrating and illustrating where some of those railroads and the old cattle trails were located. Image of barbed wire. Don't try to trip on that or don't run into that. It hurts. I speak from experience. Here is an image of the commercial feedlots or those concentrated animal feeding operations, the CAFOs. When you look at the world in livestock ranching, where is it occurring? You have the western United States, northern part of South America, and then the eastern coast of South America, southern part of Africa, Central Asia, Australia, New Zealand are your largest ranching areas. Fifth type of commercial farming is Mediterranean agriculture, most often found in areas that border the Mediterranean Sea. That's where they get their origins. But there are other parts of the world that have similar climates and are found in similar latitudes, and we'll see that on the map that follows this slide. You can also find them then in California, in Chile, in South Africa, and also Australia, New Zealand. Characteristics of the climate then is the winters are fairly mild and the summers are hot and dry, so crops that grow well there are things like olives, grapes, dates, and citrus fruits. So wine regions of the world that are well known can be found in Italy and France and California, and to some extent China and Australia. When you look at grape production in the United States, you're going to see a reoccurring theme here, California. When you look at prunes and plum production, California. When you look at lemon production, California. When you look at wine production, it says the United States, but the largest amount of wines produced out in California. You also have a bit of wine production occurring in this part of the world, over here, here, and of course in the Mediterranean region. And what we're really looking at is right around that 40-degree longitude seems to be the magic, kind of that magic latitude where the Mediterranean crops grow well. The last type of gardening is commercial gardening, which is also referred to as truck farming. It's very common in the southeastern, northeastern United States, where you have a longer growing season and humid summers. It's close to very large markets of consumers of those goods, and a lot of these crops are sold to big companies that process them, and then they put these foods into cans or they put them into the frozen products that you find at the grocery store. So things like apples and cherries and lettuce and tomatoes. Whenever possible, commercial gardeners are going to be using machinery to do the work, but there are some crops that are so delicate and bruise so easily that they can't use a machine to do it. And in that case, farmers will look for human laborers to do that. And so this is where migrant workers for farms come in, because harvesting season only typically lasts for a couple of weeks. There are different crops that harvest throughout different types of the year, so those migrant workers will travel from farm to farm to continually be harvesting and getting paid for their work. It's really difficult labor, and it's one that you find people that are arriving from other countries might be more likely to do because of the amount of skills needed to do it. You look at strawberry production here, you find workers out in California doing that, and a little bit up in Oregon. You look at apple orchards, California, Washington, Texas and Oklahoma, Florida, Georgia, a little bit in New York and Michigan, known for their apples. Peach production, largely California, Georgia and South Carolina. oranges. That's what California, or not California, that's what Florida is known for, is its orange production. Image of that harvesting of tomatoes, a crop that's very delicate. Again, being on your knees and bent over in warmer temperatures or day after day for hours at a time is really tough work. Not a lot of people want to do that work. Harvesting cranberries in Massachusetts requires you to go into a cranberry bog. When the crops are more durable, you can come up with machinery to do the work on these commercial farms. You might see something like a tree shaker for harvesting nuts. This is a map that you could refer back to if needed. It's a closer up view of the types of farming in general that occur in the different parts of the United States. Now, a German geographer named Johann von Thunen came up with a theory about farming, and you're going to have an activity after this set of notes that builds off of this theory. He looked at farming and said, well, I can kind of predict what type of farms are going to appear as we get further and further away from the city, and it's based on knowing what type of land is available, the amount of space, and how expensive is it to transport goods. So he came up with a model that was considered concentric. In other words, it looks like a bullseye or a dartboard. In the center, in the bullseye, you have a large market or a city. Outside of that, the next ring around it is going to be which type of farming? It's going to be dairy and market gardens or commercial garden farms. Outside of that, because you can see he was from the 1800s, woodlots to be found. Woodlots were important in construction and also heating homes. Outside of that, you get larger plots of land where various crops and pasture land can be used. And then as you get really far away from the city, the largest plots of land are available, and that's where animals can graze. So it looks like this. You have a city in the middle. You have the concentrated types of farming going on fairly close to the city and dairy farming. Then there might be woods or a ring of forestry. Then you're going to find larger farms where the crops can be rotated, where you might have like a livestock and mixed crop farming. And then beyond that, you have the grazing. So we're going to end up looking at, does von Thunen's model hold true today? In the United States, that's pretty difficult to do in the big picture because the land is so diverse in the U.S. But when we zoom in on a state like Minnesota, we're going to be able to take a look at it and say, all right, is there a central city? Well, yeah, the biggest population center in Minnesota is here. Then we're going to be looking at what type of farming is occurring in this ring. Then we'll look at what type of farming is occurring in this ring around it. And then we'll look at what type of farming is occurring here and see if that pattern does hold true to von Thunen. So we'll be using maps that look like this. They'll have color, and we'll be creating our own composite map that's going to help show us if von Thunen's theory holds true or not. The next set of slides is going to be subsistence, but when we start looking at the difference between commercial and subsistence, a couple things to remember. One, commercial is more commonly found in MDCs, and look at the technology. Subsistence is going to be found in LDCs, less developed countries. Again, focus on the technology. That's going to be a big determinant. It takes a lot more people to farm when you're using handheld tools than it does using a combine. Here again is that important map that we're going to need to refer back to when we do our Ag Stories activity after the second set of notes. So made that accessible for you. Important. Now you have a note check to do. Make sure to use these notes as well as the slideshow to help you complete the 10 questions. Thanks for tuning in and good luck.